body must maintain hundreds of variables within remarkably narrow limits. Warm it above the comfort zone, and heat loss mechanisms are activated. Cool it below its set point, and internal changes occur to conserve heat and warm it back up. Deprive it of water, and mechanisms for water conservation are initiated. Under these conditions, the thirst center of the brain becomes highly active, and the kidneys secrete a smaller volume of urine, which contains a higher concentration of waste products. All of these things happen automatically, allowing us to think about and accomplish other things. Physiologists refer to the body's ability to keep variables within the narrow limits required for life as homeostasis.
I'm Mike Shively, and this is Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. Do you have any questions from our previous session or sessions? Adam?
When discussing directional terms, proximal and distal, is that only used in the limbs?
Proximal and distal are primarily used in the limbs, but there are special occasions where sometimes we use them in other areas. For example, in the digestive system, sometimes the word proximal refers to a location within the alimentary canal closer to the mouth, and distal refers to a location closer to the anus. In the cardiovascular system, proximal sometimes means closer to the heart, distal means further from the heart, as a central reference for that particular system. So there are some occasions where certain directional terms may be used in ways other than the way that they're commonly defined. But primarily in human anatomy, the most common usage is in reference to the limbs. Any other questions?
I have one.
Okay.
When we were discussing the levels of organization, we talked about organic compounds. You said those were compounds containing carbon. Does that include carbon dioxide?
Now that's an interesting question, Eva, because some physiologists and chemists will consider CO2, carbon dioxide, to be organic since it does contain carbon. On the other hand, since it's such a simple compound, many times it's not considered to be. So it's kind of riding the fence between organic and inorganic. Any other questions? Okay, before we really begin talking about human body functions, I want to put up our first graphic so that we can review exactly the four major topics that I want to cover today in human body functions. So let's look at that first graphic. The first thing that I want to do today is for us to collectively review what the body does, what kinds of things that it actually is involved in a very general sort of way. I want to talk about homeostasis a little bit. It was defined in our pre-taped video there, but I want to talk about it and talk about how important that is in maintaining life. I want to talk about the concept of negative feedback, because negative feedback is the general principle that accomplishes the homeostatic mechanisms. And I want to spend some time talking about notification and activation and how those are involved in negative feedback loops and the whole homeostatic process. So let's collectively, as a group, make a list, a virtual list here, of the kinds of things that the body does. And I'll start out, the body, we move. The body moves. So that's one of the kinds of things that we could say the body does. Who else would like to contribute to that list? Adam?
We eat.
We eat, and after a while, we defecate. Okay. Now let's face it, this is physiology. We can use those sorts of words. We eat, we defecate. Okay, move, eat, defecate. What are you going to do later on today? Seth?
I'm going to go to sleep later.
We sleep.
Not too soon.
We rest. Okay. Other kinds of things. Eva?
We get sick.
We get sick and hopefully recover.
That's good too.
We don't always. So eventually we die, right? Whether we get sick or not, we eventually die. We're born, we live, we die. Let's go to some, yeah, go ahead, Adam.
We reproduce.
We reproduce. Very good. If we didn't, we wouldn't last long, would we, on Earth?
And not as a species.
Now, you mentioned eat. What's closely related to that, Starley? What about...
We breathe.
Oh, we breathe? Okay. We inhale and exhale. We take in oxygen and give off CO2. What do we do besides eat? If it's dry, we gotta...
I don't know if this follows what you were saying, but we have to break down the food. We have to digest it.
We do. We have to get those things. The physical act of putting food, into our digestive system is just the beginning of the whole digestive process. We'd certainly have to break it down into very small subunits in order to get it where it needs to go to the various cells. We drink, don't we? We urinate. What about if I step on something sharp? What do I do?
React.
We react. We certainly react to a lot of different things. We react emotionally, certainly, and we react physically in a lot of different ways to a lot of different things. Let's put up a graphic that summarizes some of the things we just said, that summarizes what the body does. And I think we've got most of the things up there probably in the list that we made. We move, we metabolize, which is what Seth was getting to. We reproduce, we thermoregulate, we control temperature, don't we? We certainly eat and drink, urinate and defecate. We circulate blood, I don't know if we mentioned that. And we react. Now, we can make a longer list. There's a lot of other kinds of things that we do to maintain our life, but these are certainly some of the kinds of things that go on in our body. Now, there are many, many, many variables in our body, levels and concentrations of different sorts of things, our body temperature, our body pH, and we must maintain many of those within relatively narrow limits in order to maintain life. We cannot stray very far from our core body temperature, for example, without getting into severe health difficulties or facing perhaps even death itself. If we get just a few degrees below our core body temperature for a sustained period of time, we'll go into severe hypothermia, which may result in death if it's not corrected. If we go just a few degrees above our core body temperature, just a few degrees, we can get in severe trouble because many of the enzymatic processes within the body will be interfered with. Proteins will be denatured and so forth and so on, and we will not be able to maintain life. On the pre-tape video, the word homeostasis was defined, and homeostasis is probably easier to understand conceptually than it is to define in words, but basically homeostasis means to maintain variables within certain limits. Maintain the status quo. Keep our body temperature close to where it needs to be. Keep our blood glucose levels close to where they need to be. Keep our blood pH close to where it needs to be. Let's put up a graphic that summarizes some of the mechanisms in which homeostasis plays a real role. Body temperature, we've mentioned that. pH, this hydrogen ion concentration. The osmolality, which is the concentration of dissolved substances within body fluids, blood and other fluids in the body. Blood calcium levels, blood glucose levels. The list could go on and on. But let's take a moment and consider each one of these individually. We'll begin our discussion with body temperature. In one of our last sessions, we talked about the fact that a lot of individuals don't have a body temperature that's exactly 98.6, but whatever your particular body temperature, whatever the home temperature is for you, your body does tempt to keep that temperature fairly close to that set point. Mine happens to be a little bit below 98.6. I'm 97 point something. I can't remember exactly what it is. But when we get cold, or feel cool, some mechanisms are activated in order to conserve heat so that the body temperature will not drop any lower, or at least in the body's attempt to keep the temperature from dropping any lower. Does anybody know what one of the mechanisms, I'm not real cold yet, I'm getting just a little bit cool. What's going to happen in my body in order to save some heat? I'm not hypothermic yet. Eva?
Your blood vessels will constrict and peripheral areas?
Blood vessels will constrict in peripheral areas, and what this will do, of course, is prevent, if I'm getting cold, that the implication, of course, is that the air surrounding me is considerably cooler than my core body temperature. And so by constricting peripheral blood vessels, I prevent blood from going out to the surface of the body and thereby radiating heat off that I need to conserve within my body. So that's the first thing that happens. Anything else that you can think of? Adam?
You begin to shiver.
When you get significantly cold, you begin to shiver. And matter of fact, you may begin to shiver. First thing that will happen, of course, is teeth will chatter a bit, okay? And then you'll begin to shiver quite violently, in fact, and uncontrollably. And, yeah, Starley?
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say that the hairs all raise.
The hairs may raise up, although sometimes that will happen early on when you just get a little bit chilled. And I don't know how much that's sustained. I confess that I've never been into clinical hypothermia, although I've felt like it a few times. Yeah, go ahead, Amber.
Like I get goosebumps. That's probably partly with the hair raising thing. Why, like the goosebumps, how does that help?
You know, that's probably a vestigial reaction. If you think of a lot of animals that have hair coats, like a kitten, for example, when it gets cold, actually when it gets scared too, but when it gets cold, it'll fluff, and by fluffing that hair coat out, standing those hairs out on end a bit, more air will be trapped in between the hairs and serve as kind of an insulating coat or layer around it. Human beings, by and large, don't have enough body hair for that to be effective, so I'm sure that the piloerection, it's called, is a vestigial mechanism in us. If the body temperature is not corrected and you're down in the hypothermic area for very long, then you may in fact find yourself facing death, because once it gets beyond a certain point, it'll tend to plummet very quickly. And the normal reaction, of course, is to get very sleepy, tired, go to sleep, and basically not wake up. Yes?
What causes you to be sleepy in the sense that your body's saying, I'm so cold, why am I all of a sudden tired?
You know, that's an interesting question, Starley. There probably is an answer that I don't know. I believe it's the body's way of saying, hey, we need to conserve all the energy that we can, even, you know, I mean, even the thought processes and so forth, because certainly when you go into a sleep mode, you're burning less energy. The basal metabolic rate is lower than it is when you're awake. So BMR, I'm sure you've heard the term basal metabolic rate, is the amount of energy that the body burns, so to speak, or uses in an at-rest situation. So you're pretty relaxed sitting there in your chairs, so you know, the amount of energy basically that you're burning as you just sit there at rest is your BMR, or basal metabolic rate, for this moment in this environment. So let's go ahead, Bryce.
You hear of some people that get cold enough that it preserves their body, and so it's like they're dead, but they're able to revive them after they've been cold for a long time. Is that
When,
because they get too cold? Or?
That's an interesting concept too. We have those situations where a child has broken through the ice or something, and been underwater in a very cold situation longer than, you know, one would expect to be able to preserve life in the individual. Probably what happens in a severe heat loss in the body like that, the whole metabolic process of the body slows down, such that certain body organs and tissues that would normally not be able to recover, the metabolic processes are slowed so much by the cold that death does not necessarily ensue. Okay. So let's go the other direction a little bit. Let's turn up the thermostat and get hot. Let's get our body temperature up above our comfort zone. What's first thing that happens? Eva, what you mentioned on cold, what's going to be the reverse of that?
Your blood vessels will dilate. You'll get red skin.
Okay, blood vessels near the surface of the body are going to dilate in an attempt to allow the body to radiate more heat away from the body in an attempt to lose that excess heat. And then what will happen? Adam?
You start to sweat.
You'll sweat. And the idea, of course, with the sweating is that evaporative cooling right after you sweat is going to help carry considerable amount of heat away from the body. If you're in a real humid, hot, humid environment, though, sometimes the evaporative processes don't work too well. Utah, where we are right here, of course, is a relatively dry, relatively low humidity environment. But having just come back recently from Texas, east central Texas, I can tell you that you can sweat in Texas and it don't help a whole lot because the humidity is so high that it just doesn't evaporate and doesn't cool you. And, as I mentioned a little bit ago, if the temperature continues to rise or is maintained, and it doesn't take very many degrees, you know, you get a body temperature up in the vicinity of 107, 108, death is beginning to be very imminent because the high temperature will cause irreversible changes in many of the enzymatic systems within the body cells. Yeah, Starlee?
I know that with some bacteria that your body will actually raise its own temperature to try to kill off that bacteria in a sense that it almost is going to kill you. Why does your body do that in a sense?
Our body seems to be able to maintain a slight increase of just a few degrees of temperature, a little bit better perhaps than some pathogenic organisms can reproduce in. And so sometimes by elevating the body temperature 3 or 4 degrees, the bacterial reproduction is significantly slowed, allowing then the body to take whatever corrective action it can to fight the remainder on its own. Let's talk about pH a little bit. We mentioned this the other day as well. The body has a normal pH range of about 7.35 to 7.45. Now, in case you need to recall what pH measures, it's actually a measurement of the hydrogen ion concentration in body fluids. So we say our blood pH is 7.35 to 7.45. 7 is considered to be a neutral pH. And if we start moving below 7, then we become acidic. If we move above 7, we're alkalytic or slightly basic. So the normal range, 7.35 to 7.45, is somewhere in the vicinity of just a bit on the basic side. Now, if we let's imagine some things that would lower the body pH. Can anybody think of something that would cause pH to go down, Adam?
Holding your breath.
Holding your breath. And the reason that holding your breath will cause pH to lower is simply because the concentration of carbon dioxide will increase in the bloodstream. Carbon dioxide, as we mentioned the other day, combines with the water that's the base of blood to make carbonic acid. So that basically lowers the pH. Instead of holding your breath, you could do some extremely strenuous exercise. And that will also accomplish the same thing, create an excess of CO2 in the bloodstream. Now, the body's way of dealing with lowered pH, the most obvious way is increased respiratory rate. And so after you've held your breath for a long time, or after you've run some wind sprints or jogged up 3 or 4 flights of stairs, as your pH goes down, the body's normal corrective mechanism is to increase respiratory rate. It's quite surprising that the body pays much less attention to the oxygen levels in the bloodstream than it does to the pH of the bloodstream. So yes, if you've been exercising, you're a little bit low perhaps on oxygen, but the body really is reacting in those situations to the lower pH. What about if I drank 3 or 4 soda pops in an hour? What would that do?
Really increase the pH.
Let's think. What's the main ingredient here besides the flavorings in a soda pop? The carbon dioxide, right? So we basically got carbonic acid. So we're going to be.
I bet it would increase the hydrogen ion.
We'll increase the hydrogen ion concentration, sure. And in case you don't remember, if you increase the hydrogen ion concentration, the pH goes down. It's an inverse relationship there, isn't it? All right, so drinking a bunch of soda pops would also lower pH. How could I raise my pH? How could you raise your pH right there in your seats?
Hyperventilate.
Hyperventilate. You can sit there and do the deep breathing thing for, you know, several breaths, and your pH, if we had a pH meter on your bloodstream, we could notice that your pH would go up a little bit, because by forcing respiration when you don't really need the oxygen, you will in fact get rid of perhaps a little bit too much CO2 as far as the body is concerned, and so your pH will go up. Now, the respiratory system is only one of 3 systems that are very heavily involved in pH control, but is probably the primary or first system that we think of because it reacts so quickly. What are 2 other systems that are involved in pH control? Adam?
Isn't the urinary system?
The urinary system has some control over pH because the kidneys can't get rid of excess hydrogen ions through some of the mechanisms during urine formation. And there's another system. Eva?
The cardiovascular system?
Cardiovascular system. There are several buffers that are present in the bloodstream, and hemoglobin itself is involved in that process as well. So we have 3 systems that are watching, that have components in here, that are watching the pH level. So it's obvious that pH is a very, very important thing to control. Osmolality. Let's go there and talk about that for just a bit. Osmolality is the concentration of dissolved substances within the body fluids. And we can think of it, we can just stick with blood for a bit. If we have a higher concentration of dissolved things in the blood, the osmolality goes up. If we have a lower concentration of dissolved things in the blood, the osmolality goes down. And when the osmolality goes up, because we have a higher concentration of dissolved substances in the bloodstream, the first thing that the body does reaction-wise is the thirst center is activated, and we feel thirsty. So if the concentration of materials dissolved in the water-based blood increases, we react to that by feeling thirsty, and then hopefully we correct that by going to the drinking fountain. If the other thing that really happens too, in addition to feeling thirsty, is something happens down in the urinary system. And what would that be? If we're getting too many concentrates in the bloodstream.
You'll start retaining water from your urine.
Okay, by retaining water from the urine, what Eva is basically saying is that we're going to manufacture urine, a smaller quantity of urine that has a larger concentration of dissolved substances in it. So we'll put out a very small or scant amount of urine that will have a lot of materials in it, waste products. On the other hand, if we've been sucking on the water fountain for no good reason and are super hydrated, the thirst center is not activated at all. We don't even want another drink for a while. And just exactly the opposite happens down in the urinary system, is we start producing copious quantities of urine, and the need to urinate happens with a much greater degree of frequency. And I think those are self-evident. Blood calcium concentrations, another thing that we put up on the screen a bit ago. And the calcium concentrations are very, very critical. There's quite narrow limit that's compatible with life. If the concentrations drop down just a little bit below the normal range for blood calcium, the calcium levels get too low in the skeletal muscles, and many of the skeletal muscles go into flaccid paralysis to the point where if the respiratory muscles get involved, then we can in fact die because we are unable to breathe. Now, Eva?
Would that also affect your cardiac muscle?
It eventually can. The cardiac muscle seems to be a little bit less affected directly than the skeletal muscle tissue, and I'm not sure what the physiology of that is. In veterinary medicine, I happen to be a veterinarian, as many of you know, and one of the interesting situations that we run into with a dairy cow that has just had a calf, sometimes she will start producing milk in such large quantities that she will in fact affect her blood calcium levels because she's producing such a large quantity of milk, and there's a lot, of course, calcium in milk. And every once in a while we'll have a dairy cow that has just had a calf that's gone into significant milk production, that blood calcium levels will drop down so low that the cow will be out in the back pasture laying down and can't get up because their skeletal muscles are so strongly affected by that. Yeah?
Does that also affect bone density?
It usually doesn't, Adam, simply because the calcium within bones, although it's in a state of dynamic equilibrium, it takes weeks and months to affect that calcium because it's in a very large inorganic compound that's not readily mobilized. When astronauts, for example, go out into outer space and have a weightless environment, their skeletal system does demineralize a bit because less stress and strain is put on the bones, but it takes a long time. You don't have to worry if you're just out there for a short period of time. Blood calcium levels get too high, you can get in trouble the opposite direction too, and I don't want to spend a great deal of time on. I just selected a few examples here of things that would demonstrate this homeostatic mechanisms that the body does employ. Many of you are familiar, of course, with glucose levels. You may know someone who has diabetes insipidus, diabetes mellitus, I'm sorry, and may have to take exogenous insulin to help correct that or keep their blood glucose levels within a reasonable range. Let's say I go home and find my wife has baked, several dozen of my favorite sugar cookies, and there is a half a gallon of cold milk in the refrigerator, and I decide that I just want to blaze out for a bit, and so I take 2 dozen sugar cookies and half a gallon of milk, and an hour later, what would my blood sugar level be in all likelihood, high or low?
High.
Probably be pretty high, wouldn't it? Because I just put a whole lot of simple carbohydrates into my bloodstream, and so my blood sugar level is going to be high. Now, the pancreas produces insulin. It has some specialized secretory cells within it that produce insulin, and that insulin is going to be secreted into the bloodstream in response to that high blood sugar level. Its job is to get the blood sugar level back down to within the normal range. It facilitates the movement of blood sugar out of the bloodstream into other body cells. And so I will have an initial spike of high blood sugar. Insulin production will go up. That insulin will cause the blood sugar levels to go back down. Unless I am a hypoglycemic individual and produce way too much insulin. And hypoglycemics tend to produce too much insulin. If I produce way too much insulin, which does what to blood sugar? Lowers it. Then my blood sugar level will go down way below where it's supposed to be. And so quite often, those individuals who have the condition that we call hypoglycemia, they'll have an initial spike and then their blood sugar level will drop significantly low. Matter of fact, it'll get so low perhaps that the brain will tend to shut down. They may pass out or at least go to sleep. Individuals that have diabetes mellitus have the opposite problem. They don't produce enough insulin, or they produce insulin that's non-functional, and as a consequence their blood sugar levels go up, and the insulin that they produce, they don't produce enough or it's not working, and so the insulin levels or the blood sugar levels tend to stay high. Starlee?
I know that with people when they get an excessive weight, that they have a chance of getting diabetes. Is it because their body can't produce enough insulin to take in whatever their amount of food they're taking in, the amount of sugars that are coming in, carbohydrates?
I'm not sure what all the pathophysiology of that situation is. If you'll forgive the expression, there is a phrase that's used in medicine among biomedical professionals called fat, female, and 40. That puts an individual at very high risk for diabetes mellitus, and I'm not sure what all's going on. I think there are some explanations for some of the questions you asked there, but I'm not sure what the internal mechanisms are. So, all right, now this is some of the things that the body does, and some of the things that it attempts to control with this homeostatic mechanism. So, how does it do this? Well, the overall overriding principle physiologically for homeostasis is a concept called negative feedback. Now, to understand negative feedback, I think the easiest way would be to think of the thermostat on a central heat and air conditioning system. Let's say we have the thermostat set at 70 degrees, and overnight it's cool, gets down to 65 or something. The lower temperature is going to cause the furnace to do what? Turn on. So when the temperature drops, the furnace will be activated, furnace turns on, furnace produces heat, house warms up, thermostat says, hey, it's getting to be 74 degrees here. What will it do? Turn it off. Or if the outside temperature continues to rise as the sun warms things up and it gets to be 85 or 90 outside, and even though the furnace is turned off, the temperature inside continues to rise, it's going to turn on the air conditioner, which is going to lower the house temperature back down. When the temperature gets down within a certain amount of the set range, wherever the thermostat is set, the air conditioner will be turned off. Nothing will be happening if we're right where we're supposed to be. But if it gets too high again, the air conditioner will come back on. If it gets too low again, the furnace will come back on. Now, the basic idea here is that we've got a set point for the temperature of the house. We've got a thermostat that has a thermometer on it that is checking the temperature, and we've got some feedback mechanisms to both the furnace and the air conditioner that whenever we get one direction or another away from this set point, the furnace is turned on or the air conditioner is turned on as necessary in order to correct the temperature that's getting too far outside the normal range. The whole idea is called negative feedback. Whenever we get away, negative, whether we're talking about above or below, away from the set point or set range, then some feedback mechanisms are going to be activated to take corrective action. And basically, negative feedback mechanisms are what physiology is all about as far as maintaining homeostasis. We've got to get the variables back into the normal range or near the normal set point. Let's take a look at a graphic that summarizes the concepts of negative feedback. There's a sensor someplace, that would be the thermostat in our example that we use, that notes the fact that there's some kind of change in the variable that we're talking about. There's a center that's notified, hey, we're getting away from where we're supposed to be. There's an effector that is activated. An effector is something that can make a change. So the appropriate effector is activated, change occurs, and then the sensor is either turned off, hey, we're back where we need to be, or perhaps if we went too far in the direction that we were correcting, if we overcorrected, an opposing sensor is activated. So if we warm the house up too much, the air conditioner will come on. If we cool it down too much, the furnace will come back on. So that's the general idea of negative feedback. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to just spend a few minutes in the remainder of our session here together talking about some of the kinds of items that are involved in notification and activation. And I want to talk about sensory receptors for a little bit first. Now, sensory receptors in the body are cells and or groups of cells that convert some kind of energy into nervous impulses. And we can take all of the sensory receptors in the body and we can divide them into 5 major kinds. There's those that respond to light, and when you shine a light on them, they initiate nervous impulses. There are those that respond to various chemicals. There are those that respond to some kind of movement, like stretching or vibration. There are those that respond to temperature change. And finally, there's those that respond to what we call collectively pain. Now the first group, the ones that respond to light, we call those photoreceptors. And they're found in the retina of the eye, and when light shines on them, they generate impulses. The ones that respond to chemicals, we call them chemoreceptors. They're located, well, the first ones we think of are located in the oral mucosa within what we call taste buds, and there's certainly a bunch of them located in the nasal mucosa. And those, of course, when they're activated, give us impulses that result in the senses that we call taste and smell. But there are other chemoreceptors that are more deeply located in the body that pay attention to things like the pH change that we were talking about earlier, or pay particular attention to levels of certain things in the bloodstream. Thermoreceptors respond to temperature change, and it's interesting that we have certain ones that respond and generate impulses in response to cold. We have other thermoreceptors that generate impulses when they're heated up. So it's not the same receptor working both ends of the spectrum there. It's different receptors that are involved in generating impulses in response to heat or cold. Mechanoreceptors, the ones that respond to some kind of motion, pressure, stretching, vibrations, those sorts of things, are probably the widest or largest group of sensory receptors. There's lots of different mechanoreceptors within the body. There's some within muscle bellies and some within muscle tendons. There's pressure receptors within the skin so that you can tell if you're just barely touching something, and so forth and so on. The receptors that we call nociceptors or pain receptors have been shown to be chemoreceptors as well. They respond to certain chemicals that are released in response to injurious responses in the body. So the job of a sensory receptor is to generate an impulse. Now, it doesn't carry the impulse anyplace because the sensory receptors are just a local phenomenon wherever they're located. But it generates that impulse, and then the impulse is synaptically transferred over to a sensory neuron, which carries that impulse on into the central nervous system someplace, into the brain or spinal cord. So a sensory receptor generates the impulse, a sensory neuron carries it in to a locus where it is interpreted, and then corrective action, if we're talking about one of these homeostatic mechanisms, is taken, and the result is going to be a motor impulse going out to something else. Starley?
When you're numbing something, where in that chain is it broken? When you give yourself a shot to numb that area for surgery or whatnot,
Sure.
Where in that chain?
Local anesthetics interfere with nerve impulse transmission. So they're going to interfere with the movement of the impulse within the sensory neuron. And they do that by interrupting the normal flow of sodium, potassium ions that are involved in the nervous impulse itself in the sensory neuron. So we have then impulses coming back out that may go to effectors that make a change. Now, what kinds of things can make a change in the body? And we talk about effectors, but that's a nebulous term, a virtual term. What are the effectors of the body that a motor impulse would go to? Seth?
Maybe go to muscles, smooth.
Go to
skeletal.
muscle tissue, and we'll talk about the fact we got 3 different kinds of muscle tissue, but could go to muscle tissue, and there's another one. Eva?
Glandular tissue?
Glandular epithelium. Muscle tissue and glandular epithelium are the first effectors that we'd think of, at least that a nervous impulse would be affecting. And so muscle tissue can be affected by that motor impulse or glandular epithelium. Muscle tissue, of course, then is going to contract or not contract as the situation demands, and glandular epithelium is either going to secrete or not secrete as the situation demands. Now, of course, the sensory receptors are not the only way that we can get information in and transfer information from one location to another. There's also chemical regulators in the body besides the nervous impulses that we just talked about. And the first chemical regulator that everyone thinks about is what?
Hormones?
Hormone. What is a hormone? Let's define it. We'll talk about it a lot more when we get to the endocrine system later on in this course. But a hormone is a chemical substance that's produced someplace in the body, travels basically all over the body by way of the bloodstream, and exerts its effect in certain other locations. Maybe one location, maybe multiple locations. And the reason it doesn't exert an effect every place is because many parts of the body may not have what's called receptors to a particular hormone. I've got a set of keys here, and as far as I know, this key only works one car out in the parking lot. I haven't tried them all yet. But then the reason it works my car is because my car has the particular receptor for this key. And the hormones have that same kind of thing in what's called their targets, certain places that they can exert an effect only because those places receive those particular hormones.
So when we talked earlier about insulin being produced by the pancreas, is that a hormone?
Insulin is one of several dozen hormones, you bet. So when the pancreas produces the insulin, it goes into the bloodstream, goes all over the body. Matter of fact, body cells in general, it has a wide range of targets. Body cells in general react to insulin, and it facilitates the movement of glucose into the cytoplasm of those cells. In addition to hormones, though, there are other chemical regulators. A hormone, we didn't used to recognize these because we didn't really realize that they existed until just a few decades ago, but there are chemical regulators that are produced that actually have a very local effect, that don't even have to leave the organ where they're produced. And those kinds of things basically defy the definition of hormones, since they don't travel throughout the bloodstream all over the body, or their target is not someplace else. Their target may be in the same organ that produces them, and they may be called paracrine regulators or autocrine regulators. And but those are chemical kinds of regulation. So we've got muscle tissue and glandular epithelium that do something in response. We've got nervous impulses and chemical regulators that send messages out. Let's consider now some specific kinds of, well, before we do that, let's take a look at a graphic that'll summarize some of the things we just said. A graphic on notification and activation. We've talked about sensory receptors, and we said they generate impulses in response to certain stimuli. One of the things I'd say while we're right here is that sensory impulses are very stimulus specific. They respond to a given receptor responds to one particular stimulus only. Nervous impulses are electrochemical phenomena. Those that are going into the brain and spinal cord are called sensory impulses. Those that are coming back out of the brain or spinal cord are called motor impulses. Chemical regulators include hormones, paracrine regulators, and autocrine regulators. Incidentally, the difference between a paracrine regulator and an autocrine regulator is autocrine regulator is a chemical, hormone-like substance that acts on the very same tissue of the same organ that produced it, and a paracrine regulator acts on the same organ but a different tissue, so either right in this exact same place or close to the same place for those two. And the effectors that we talked about were muscle tissue and glandular epithelium, and then in some cases we have body cells in general that act in response to a particular stimulus. Thyroid hormone, for example. When thyroid hormone is released into the bloodstream, thyroid hormone will in fact activate or increase the basal metabolic rate of body cells in general. There are many, many cells besides just muscle cells that will react to that. So we have increased energy utilization in cells across the board. All right, you have any questions about any of those concepts before we go on? Yeah, Ryan?
We've been talking about how the regulators and effectors go to different organs and whatnot. Sometimes in the elderly they start shaking. Is that because those aren't working right? And they get the shakes? Or?
Well, there's more than one reason that an older person might shake. When you see the severe shaking of the hands, you know, maybe you've noticed it in me already, right? That's Parkinson's disease, okay? And I'm not sure if there's something short of Parkinson's disease that, you know, my wife's been watching my hands lately, and she says, I think you're getting there, Michael, but I don't know. I don't know if there's anything short of Parkinson's that causes that or not, Bryce.
Okay.
I really don't know. Any other questions? Yeah, Eva?
I have one. You're talking about vision being related to photoreceptors and smell and taste being chemoreceptors. What about hearing? Are those mechanoreceptors because they
They are.
respond to
When we talk about the ear,
vibrations
we'll
you're
go into
talking
that a
about?
lot deeper, but let's just talk about that right now. It's a very interesting phenomenon. As I'm talking to you, my voice, my vocal folds in my larynx are actually causing air molecules to vibrate, and those vibrating air molecules are permeating this whole studio. And then some of those vibrations will then be collected into your external acoustic meatus and strike your tympanic membranes or eardrums and make your eardrums vibrate just a little teeny tiny bit. It's such a small amount of movement that it basically cannot be detected. That then, on the other side of the tympanic membrane, are the three auditory ossicles that we all learned about, you know, down in grade school, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, or malleus, incus, and stapes. Those three little tiny bones carry those vibrations across the cavity of the middle ear, and the base of the stapes fits into a oval opening in the temporal bone, on the other side of which there's some fluid called perilymph. So basically we've got the vibrations now passing through the tympanic membrane through three bones, and now the perilymph on the other side of that base of the stapes is vibrating. So we'll have little hydrostatic vibrations in that perilymph. Those vibrations then are ultimately transferred to some sensory receptors that are mechanoreceptors. They're called hair cells, and there's little tiny cytoplasmic projections on those hair cells that the vibrations cause to move. And in response to that, the hair cells generate impulses, which are synaptically transmitted to sensory neurons. The sensory neurons carry the impulses into the brain, and voila, you hear whatever I said. And it's you know, if it weren't a true story, it'd be a phenomenal one, wouldn't it? It's just kind of like those photoreceptors that you were talking about a second ago, Eva, in the retina of the eye. You know, we think we see with our eyes. The reality is the rods and cones within the retina simply generate impulses. Those impulses are synaptically transferred to sensory neurons within the optic nerves, which carry those impulses back to the occipital lobes of the cerebral hemispheres, and it's within those occipital lobes of the cerebral hemispheres that the impulses are actually interpreted as vision. So we just generate impulses basically with the retinas of our eyes. We don't actually do the seeing, quote, there. That's all happened back in the occipital lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. Any other questions? Eva?
You mentioned that insulin is a hormone. What other hormones are there that we might know about?
Well, when we talk about the endocrine system, Eva, we'll actually mention probably more hormones than you care to hear about. There are actually several dozen different chemical regulators in the body, in the vicinity of 40-some that are recognized as hormones per se. Just to give you some examples, the pituitary gland releases several into the bloodstream, and you probably are familiar with adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. Certainly everybody is familiar with growth hormone. The pancreas itself, back to that one for a second, since we mentioned insulin, it also produces glucagon. Okay. The kidneys produce a couple of hormones. Erythropoietin is one, and renin is one. Small intestine actually produces about 3 different hormones. The organ in the body that produces the most hormones, incidentally, is not the pituitary gland, but it's the hypothalamus. And at least 10 different hormones are known to be produced by the hypothalamus, some of which actually are transferred down to the pituitary gland for subsequent release, and many of which actually act on the pituitary gland or target the pituitary gland. So it's a very complex subject when you get to endocrinology, because many of the hormone producers act or target other hormone producers, which may target other hormone producers. It's a very, very complex interwoven fabric as far as the chemical control mechanisms go. What I'd like to do now is, in our remaining time today, is I would like to talk about some specific examples of how the body makes changes when certain changes are demanded and why that occurs. We're not going to get into the details of exactly the specific mechanisms, but the generalities of those situations. Let's take a situation where maybe I'm carrying a box. Maybe I've got two boxes stacked up because I'm helping somebody move. I can't even see over the top box. And then I come out here, and unbeknownst to me, but I soon find out, somebody plops yet another box on top of my two boxes, okay? Now, you've probably been in this situation where you've suddenly had more weight added to your body than what you've been carrying or what you expect to have at the moment. And you know what happens. You tend to buckle down a little bit, you know, for just a second, and then if you are able to carry that total amount of weight, you recover and walk around with the added burden. So let's talk about the mechanisms that are involved in that kind of thing, where extra weight or extra demand is suddenly placed, you know, on certain skeletal muscles. What actually happens in those situations is the muscle bellies have stretch receptors that are located within them. And when those stretch receptors get suddenly stimulated by, in this case, additional weight being added, they generate impulses. Those sensory impulses then are synaptically transferred to sensory neurons, which carry the impulses into the central nervous system, either the brain or the spinal cord, depending on which muscles we're talking about. And then the brain or spinal cord will send back motor impulses to the appropriate muscles to cause those muscles to contract and recover the situation, if you're physically able. Now, if somebody drops, you know, 500 pounds in the next box on top of your load, and you have more than you can carry, there's other stretch receptors within the tendons of certain muscles that will be stimulated, and when those stretch receptors are stimulated, they basically generate impulses that, once the feedback loop comes around, says to the muscles, you can't carry this load, forget it, collapse, drop down, because to attempt to contract with sufficient force is beyond the physiologic capability. And so that's an example of some of the feedback mechanisms that can occur in a situation like that. Now, another one that everybody is familiar with is what happens when somebody shines a bright light in your eyes. Let's say you're out for your nightly walk in the park, and somebody comes up with a real bright flashlight and shines it directly in your eyes. Now, you might say something like, oh, please don't shine that light in my eyes. But what's going maybe not. But what in fact is going to happen, first of all, the pupils in a dark situation, are they going to be constricted or are they going to be dilated?
Dilated.
They're going to be very dilated, aren't they? Okay? So they're dilated because it's so dark that the photoreceptors aren't getting enough in the retina, the rods and cones aren't getting enough, in this case just rods, aren't getting enough light to actually generate impulses. So they're dilated as much as possible in order to gather in as much light as possible. And somebody comes along and suddenly shines a bright light, what's going to happen to the pupils? They're going to constrict very, very quickly. Okay? And the reason for that is the bright light is actually overdriving the photoreceptors if the pupillary opening is significantly dilated to the point where negative feedback loop will go around and say, hey, constrict or contract some smooth muscle tissue within the irises of the eye that will cause the pupillary openings to crank down. And then, if they take the light away, you're still in a dark situation. With more time, what will happen, of course, is the pupils will dilate back out again. Have you noticed also, just while we're talking about eyes in dark situations, when you go from a light environment into a suddenly, open the door and go into the bedroom and can't find the light switch or the light's burnt out, you can't see anything for a little bit, but within just a few seconds, if there's still light on in the hall or whatever, you can begin to see a little bit better and better. It's because 2 or 3 things are happening here. First of all, the pupils will dilate to allow more light to come in to the retinas, And secondly, the photoreceptors in the bright light, some of the photoreceptors have been bleached out, particularly some of the rods have been bleached out in a bright light situation. When we get in a dim light situation, that takes several moments for them to, quote, dark adapt to the place where they can begin generating impulses in response to the light that strikes them. I've got a couple other examples that we could look at here, see if you can figure out what's going to happen. Let's say we grab, we're cooking breakfast, okay? Cast iron skillet. And we grab a hold of the cast iron handle of the cast iron skillet after it's been on, the heat's been too high, you know, so we say we need to get it off that burner. But when we grab it, we get burned, okay? And so what's the normal reaction in that sort of situation? What's going to happen?
Scream and let go.
You're going to immediately avoid that noxious stimulus, are you not? And what happens there is thermoreceptors, the ones that respond to heat, are activated. They generate impulses. The impulses are synaptically transferred to sensory neurons. The sensory impulses go into the brain and or spinal cord, depending on where we are. In this case, it would be spinal cord. And even at the moment that you're realizing that the skillet was hot and that you need to get away from it, you've already taken evasive action. The body has already caused you to turn loose of it and get away from it. You don't sit there and say, you know, this skillet's a little bit too hot and I think I'm burning my hand, I'd better move it. No. It all happens very, very quickly to the point where you are actually turning loose of it at the same time, basically, that it registers up here in your brain that you've burned yourself. So that's an example of a negative feedback situation. Yeah, Bryce?
I've had experiences where I've grabbed live wires and you can't let go of them. So what would
you know what? Sometimes when you get a hold of, you form a short circuit on an electrical situation, particularly, you know, 110's bad about this. What happens is the electrical current will stimulate some of the skeletal muscles to contract to the place where they're contracting so forcefully that you may not be able to let go. And so that's the situation that's happening in that situation.
Okay.
Been there, done that. I think we're done.